Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on culturally responsive focus groups, and I'll be introducing Dr. Jory Hall in 2 seconds. Just to help you navigate the GoToWebinar menu, on the top right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see an orange box with a white arrow. If you click on the white arrow, it'll open up the menu. And feel free to type in questions at any point during the presentation, but we'll be taking the questions at the end. Also, we have the PowerPoint slide handout in the handout section, so feel free to download that if you'd like. Everyone is on mute just for noise control, and we are recording this, so you'll get the recording a few days after this presentation. So again, thank you for joining us. So I'm just going to do a few introductions. So first, myself, I'm Stacy Penna. I'm the NVivo Community Director here at QSR. I'll be talking a little bit more about the community at the end. And I've been lucky enough to be working with my co-organizer of the webinar series, Ali from SAGE. So I'll let Ali introduce herself.
Thank you, Stacy, and hi, everyone. I hope you're having a good afternoon so far. I'm Ali Owen. I'm the commissioning editor for research methods books at SAGE Publications, and I'm based in the London office and work with authors in methods working in the social sciences all over the world, and I'm really happy to be here today with Stacy and Jori.
Thanks, Ali. And to introduce our presenter, Dr. Jory Hall. She's Associate Professor in the Qualitative Research and Evaluation Methodologies program at the University of Georgia. She's a multidisciplinary researcher and evaluator focused on social inequalities and the overall rigor of social science research. Specifically, her work addresses issues of evaluation and research methodology, cultural responsiveness, and the role of values and privilege within the fields of education and health. So welcome, Dr. Hall.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. I'm going to make you presenter right now.
Wonderful. Okay, can you see?
It's not on slideshow yet, but we can see the PowerPoint.
Okay, how about now?
Yep, now we can see it, perfect.
Okay. All right, well, thank you all for joining me today. As you can see here, my presentation is culturally responsive focus groups. And so to begin, I'm going to share a little bit about how the presentation got started, where it comes from, and then I'm also going to define how I think about cultural responsiveness. Then we're going to take a bit of time to explore how focus groups can advance cultural responsiveness. Then I will share points of consideration when using culturally responsive focus groups. Then we're going to take a moment to look at a brief example that I will provide from the field. And then we're going to wrap up with some resources that I hope you'll find helpful. So to begin, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce my book and that this presentation is based on this book, which is anchored in the scholarship of qualitative research and culturally responsive evaluation. So the book highlights some of my own experiences in the field and the work of others through case examples. Specifically, the book chapters discuss how one might work in culturally responsive ways with youth, older adults, women of color, and indigenous peoples. Although the book focuses on these groups, the intent of the book overall is really to inspire researchers and evaluators to think critically and creatively about working with cultural groups who have been and continue to be marginalized, stigmatized, oppressed, or vulnerable. So today's presentation will highlight some of the points I make in the book. So this means that I'm taking a very broad view with the hope that the things I share will encourage you to be more critical, thoughtful, and ethical with the groups of folks that you're working with or plan to work with. So I thought the best best place to begin would be to clarify what I mean by cultural responsiveness. And to do this, I want to consider first my notion of culture. And my notion of culture is informed by a statement on cultural competence that was put out by the American Evaluation Association in 2011. The statement refers to culture as the shared experiences among people. These experiences include, but aren't limited to, languages, values, customs, beliefs, worldviews, ways of knowing, and ways of communicating. Also, cultural dimensions can include traditional demographic markers like race, ethnicity, gender, age, religion, and social class. I consider contextual dimensions like geographic region, socioeconomic circumstances as essential to shaping culture as well. And you should know also that cultural groupings can be formed around shared interests like hip hop culture. And so I note that culture shapes people and people shape culture. Ultimately, attending to culture requires being responsive. So I just want to take a minute to share my thoughts on what I mean by being responsive, right? The notion of being responsive to me suggests a relationship. We respond to someone or people so that they become part of the inquiry process in meaningful ways. So responsiveness then demands that we as researchers productively engage relationships in the inquiry context by doing what? Continuously engaging and questioning ourselves, our team members, and stakeholders in terms of the assumptions that we have. I led a co-authored paper where I discussed this notion of responsiveness and how it should push us to deepen our receptivity and attention to the cultural and contextual dimensions of a setting or a program. I also want to note that my notion of responsiveness refers to researcher reflexivity and then also researcher flexibility, and methodological adaptation. So Weston noted that the contextual dimensions and cultural dimensions can interact with program design in unforeseen ways. And it's because of that that we need researcher flexibility and methodological adaptation, right, to respond to issues as they emerge. So in short, what does this mean? Responsiveness to me refers to approaching inquiry in a way with a stance of openness, a willingness to revise one's designs, to reflectively think about our assumptions, and to adapt and be flexible in response to issues that may emerge. I also want to note that the way I think about cultural responsiveness is informed by critical theory. Critical theory is what some people call a paradigm. And here you can see in the picture indicating that critical theory is the lens, right, through which I view the world. A common way to talk about paradigms or worldviews is to discuss the three ologies: axiology, epistemology, and ontology. So briefly, in terms of axiology, a critical theorist would value social critique and praxis, and they are considered very much imperative to bringing about critical social change. In terms of epistemology, critical theorists really assume that knowledge is mediated by power relations that are socially and historically constituted. And lastly, in terms of ontology, critical theorists contend that social, political, culture, gender-based structures have indeed oppressed certain groups for so long that the marginalization of these groups are assumed to be natural or the way things ought to be. Critical theorists, to be clear, oppose this view. Essentially, critical theorists seek to question traditional power relations and dismantle dominant forms of oppression. So what does this critical theory lens mean for my view of cultural responsiveness? Let's go ahead and put this all together. So this slide aims to bring everything I just said together here by presenting a visual framework for cultural responsiveness, which is adapted from my book. So to bring everything together, what I'm saying to you is that cultural responsiveness is a stance, it's a mindset that aims to advance social justice and centering the culture of people in the context in which they're embedded. It positions the researcher as a lifelong learner, learning and importantly unlearning how to value participants' culture in the inquiry process is necessary. It demands inquiry reflexivity. Again, that means questioning assumptions throughout the inquiry process. It recognizes the researcher as being interconnected with others and committed to rational, empathetic, and respectful care. Also, it advances a strength-based approach. What does that mean? Identifying participants' culture as an asset and not a deficit. Also, it identifies the researcher as a change agent, responsible for engaging the power and privilege in the inquiry setting. And that's where you see the critical theory perspective really shine through here. Also, it provides opportunities for others to describe who they are and how they want to be identified. It is committed to working with others to co-construct knowledge within the inquiry setting. It operates with the awareness that culture is dynamic and it occurs on individual and collective levels. And lastly, this cultural responsiveness that I'm advancing here today, it employs culturally responsive theories. And these can include indigenous, for example, theories, Black feminist thought, Lat crit, right? As well as culturally responsive methodologies. So just to be clear, what I'm saying to you is that my stance of cultural responsiveness acknowledges that all inquiry is culturally situated. Inquiry is not culture or context or value free, right? And also I want to make the point right here that I think is hugely important. Cultural responsiveness is not an add-on approach. It's not something you do that's intended to be extra. I think Thomas and Parsons put it best. Cultural responsiveness is a part of high quality evaluation or research. It's essential. It's a process. It's not just something that you do. It's not you as a researcher parachuting into a community or organization with a backpack full of answers. No, it is an ongoing ethical commitment to participant fairness and equity. So now that I hopefully have clarified to you my stance on cultural responsiveness, I want to move quickly into some ideas about design. So one of my students shared with me, she said, Dr. Hall, I really didn't understand cultural responsiveness with respect to design. I think you should say something about that. So this slide is dedicated to her. And I want to make very clear that cultural responsiveness can be used with a number of inquiry designs and methods. And so what does that mean? It can be used with ethnography, case study, narrative, participatory action research, for example. It can be also used with a number of methods. It can be used with surveys, observations. Today's focus, though, as you can see, is on focus groups. So we are going to really spend a lot of time talking about that, right? So I'm going to share some ways to think about how to advance cultural responsiveness through focus groups and what to consider when conducting focus groups. But before I do that, we have to clarify, well, what is a focus group? So to be clear, as you can see here, a focus group is a qualitative research method designed to generate information about a particular topic through a group discussion. Now, some points to consider here. Questions are asked by the researcher that focus the group discussion, and those questions will determine the type of information generated from the collective conversation. The other thing to note that makes focus group distinct is that it really does aim to generate a conversation among the group itself. So this means that the point is not for the interviewer to have one-on-one conversations in the group. You really want to get people to talk to each other in the group. Also important to note, in a focus group, the interviewer does not take center stage. No, the focus group is on the participants themselves. And in this way, focus groups are really valuable to provide cultural insights related to group language, behavior, social practices, and activities. Now, that said, it's important to note that focus groups in and of themselves don't just automatically advance cultural responsiveness. There's nothing here in this definition that you see that specifically speaks to cultural responsiveness. But focus groups can be positioned in a way to advance cultural responsiveness. So let's take a moment to think about how might that work? How can a focus group advance cultural responsiveness, right? So first, it begins in the preliminary stages of design. You want to think about working collaboratively with participants to consider their needs, interests, concerns to develop the protocol. That's hugely important to advance cultural responsiveness. You want to collaborate with them, if possible, to implement the focus groups themselves and really think carefully about how to disseminate the findings. Oftentimes, folks will consider presenting the findings with participants, right? Bringing them to the conference, if you're an academic, for example, going out into the community and sharing the results with others or decision makers. These are ways that we can really think better about being responsive. Also, the format of the focus group itself can advance cultural responsiveness, as there are more participants than there are researchers in the focus groups, right? Unlike in a one-on-one interview format. So in this way, it provides an opportunity to flatten this power hierarchy that exists between a researcher and participant. So that's very good for advancing cultural responsiveness. Also, I want to make mention that a focus group can advance cultural responsiveness because it can be modified in different ways so that it can be suitable for the participants. There's no one way to stage a focus group. The other thing I'd like to share is that the discussion format really does align with values and principles related to interconnectedness, collective thinking, collective working together, which are so important to many cultural groups. So again, these are some ways to think about advancing cultural responsiveness. Other ways that it can advance cultural responsiveness is from the data it produces itself, right? When you have focus group data, it can offer rich information on the dynamics of the group and their perceptions. From a critical theory perspective, the data from the focus group can also disrupt any negative stereotypes related to marginalized social identities, right? The meta-narrative about certain groups being lazy or undervalued can be disrupted when the group speaks for itself and gives examples of different ways to think about what's going on, which is hugely important. And it can also reveal how privilege and systems of oppression are experienced. You can definitely get that from focus group data. But again, all that relies on the questions being asked. So the other thing to think about is where is the focus group situated within the overall design to enhance cultural responsiveness? One thing you might consider doing is starting with the focus group at the initial stage of inquiry to help you think about items for the next stage for the questionnaire, right? So that way the questionnaire items could be really tailored to the group that you're intending to work with. Also, the information from a focus group can be used to clarify findings. So let's say you started with a survey, but you had some interesting findings that you really weren't clear about. You can conduct a focus group to, in some ways, work through those contradictions, those misunderstandings to get at least some additional insights or further clarifications. Now, all that sounds really good and great, but we also have to be mindful that focus groups, like any other method, they do have limitations. So let's look at some of the limitations. Focus groups may not be suitable for highly controversial topics. And so like today's political climate, right? If your research or evaluation focused on something relative to the politics of the day, you might consider interviews as a better method, right? So really think about the topic you want to engage. Also, focus groups have issues with confidentiality. What do I mean by that? Well, in an individual interview, you can say to the participant, I will keep what's shared confidential. However, in a focus group context, as a researcher or evaluator, you cannot control what other people say or don't say about the topics raised in a focus group. So you can't necessarily promise that everything will be kept confidential. And so you have to make that clear to participants. You may keep it confidential, but you can't control what other folks do. Also, a limitation are the number of questions. When I design a focus group protocol, for example, about that, we have thunderstorms here right now. So
okay, yeah, no problem.
For the internet connection.
Okay.
network. Okay, so issues with confidentiality. Hopefully the internet connection will stay stable. We're in the middle of a thunderstorm. But again, you can't guarantee that folks in the group won't share the information, unlike in a interview situation, one-on-one interview. So that could be a limitation, because again, you have less control over that. The other thing you want to think about are the limited number of questions that you can ask in a focus group situation. And so again, remembering that the point of the focus group is to have people talk to each other. And so you want to allot time for that, which means you will pull back on the number of questions you ask so that people can have more time to answer them in the group, right, and respond to what you're asking. The other thing is the moderator must be very skilled in facilitating a group discussion. Ideally, you want someone with experience doing this work. It takes a special person to moderate a group discussion, and this is because of the last bullet. There are unanticipated outcomes that are likely to occur. And what this means is, you know, everything from people can get very excited, and so you'll have to know how to rein folks in a little bit, to people becoming very irate, or feeling unhappy, or things of this nature, or people not participating, right? You'll have to figure out how can you draw people in. So it is really a skill set that is needed to facilitate group discussions. So for the next portion, I want to go over some points of consideration when conducting the focus groups. And in the book, I suggest how focus groups can be more responsive when we're working with youth or older adults. I also cover in the book Indigenous-oriented and feminist-oriented focus groups. But rather than focus on a particular group for this presentation, I really want to offer points of consideration when implementing focus groups relative to recruitment, incentives, participation, sample size, segmentation, environment, and how do we establish quality. So let's go. So hopefully you can still hear me okay. I'm going to go ahead and talk about recruitment a little bit. So when working with particularly cultural groups, Kakali Bhattacharya is a qualitative researcher, and she really emphasizes this notion of informed consent. And so you really want to consider how it is that you're informing people about the project. And when you're thinking about cultural responsiveness, this means adjusting for reading level when you're crafting the consent forms, right? The font size for folks who may need those adjustments, even maybe considering folks who may not be as literate. And so you may want to decide, well, do I really need to get a signature here? Can a mark suit, especially if it's a child? And then also, people do creative things to get informed consent. They create videos with the information for the research so people can understand it that way. Providing plenty of room and opportunity for folks to answer questions. Many cultural groups have been not well served, to say the least, by research and evaluation work. And so you really want to make sure you provide time for answering their questions. Data ownership, particularly with respect to Indigenous groups, is a major concern. So spelling out very clearly, particularly if you do an activity, which I'll talk about later in a group, who owns the data, right, that you're collecting from the focus groups, and being very explicit about that, how the data will be used. You want to be very clear about that as well. And so nowadays, a lot of this happens online, and so you want to make necessary allowances for that. The other thing is to be clear about permissions and gatekeepers. I can't tell you how important this is. Do not underestimate understanding where you need to get permissions from and understanding the gatekeepers in the context. And so for Indigenous groups, gatekeepers may include elders in the community, for example. For youth, obviously it's their parents or legal guardians. For older adults, though, you may have to work with a caregiver to make sure that everything is above board with their participation in the focus group. And then also you want to think about access answer the sites and participants. Okay, yeah, so basically you want to make sure that you have access to the site and participants, which sounds obvious, but it could be, for example, that you only have access for a limited amount of time. with children, and so we only could work with them during their lunch break, for example. So don't underestimate understanding your access to the site itself and the participants themselves. And I tend to over-recruit, particularly dealing with certain cultural groups, because as has been said before, some groups have been considered hard to reach, but I really agree with what other people in this webinar series who suggest that it's more accurate to point out that these groups are actually more likely hardly reached. And so because of that, I tend to over-recruit, understanding that I'll need to work really hard to establish trust with groups who I don't know and who don't know me. And so I rely on my networks to put in a good word on my behalf. The other thing is, what this means in practice is that we really have to be creative about our recruitment strategies. What do I mean by that? So, for example, there was a study I was a part of that was looking at Black and Caribbean men's experiences with prostate cancer. Black men were the group that we were focusing on. And so the researcher went to, in that case, went to barbershops, right, and conducted the focus groups there, again, being creative. Another study looked at women's experiences with breast cancer, and they wanted to look at young college-age women. So what did she do? This particular researcher went to college sororities to recruit women, young women. The other one was a study, for example, that looked at cervical cancer among Black women. Those women were recruited from the hair salon. So again, thinking creatively and outside of the box around recruitment strategies. Common places that folks go to recruit would be like community centers, retirement homes in the case of older adults, and even consider places of worship. So be open and flexible around that as well. To enhance my recruitment strategies, I often think about, in some cases it makes sense for pre-existing groups. I do a lot of work with schools. So for example, teachers are often part of grade level groupings. And so it could be that I am working with 6th grade level teachers or math teachers if it's a subject grouping. And so these pre-existing groups, if they're a member of a club, for example, then it also enhances the likability that you'll be able to recruit other members of that group. So that can strengthen your recruitment with certain cultural groups. Also, the timing of the focus group. You want to take great care to consider the timing of the focus group itself. There's 2 ways to think about, well, at least 2 ways. So one is think about the pre-existing time slot. The group may meet on Tuesdays at 4. Perhaps you may want to conduct your focus group on Tuesday at 4. So that way you're not inconveniencing folks, right? You also want to think about holidays, rituals, ceremonies, certain days of the weeks when scheduling that may be inappropriate. So those are things to keep in mind in terms of recruitment of cultural groups. Moving on to incentives. These days, it is very common for people to incentivize their work through gift vouchers. I am not against this. I think that that can be totally appropriate. However, you do want to think about maybe doing something beyond a generic gift card if it makes sense. So for example, typically folks that I know give out Amazon gift cards, not trying to pub up Amazon, but you may want to think more creatively. And another study someone did, they did a tailored gift card. They allowed the participants to decide what organization they wanted to get the gift card from. So it was more tailored and the participants felt more empowered because it was personalized. That may not make sense for everyone, but again, depending on the context, you may also think about your own skills and expertise that can be offered as an incentive. So this could mean offering a workshop, a seminar, training, or even access to an event as an incentive. Sometimes the participants themselves are surprisingly happy to give focus group feedback, knowing and trusting that you're assisting their community. And so it could be just enough that the incentive is the focus group participation itself. Now, as we come out of the pandemic, it could be that when we meet in person, it may make sense to offer refreshments. It may not make sense to do that. But if it does, you'll have to consider that with respect to what kind of refreshments to offer. Takeaways can be really good, particularly for some groups, because they may not want to eat it there, but they may want to take it home and eat it later. And there's a study that talked about that, how the participants were very happy to get something to eat, but they didn't want to eat it there. They wanted it to wrap it up and take it. and eat it in the privacy of their home. So, and I'll talk more about how I provided refreshments for a group I was working with, and childcare as well, particularly for women who disproportionately are responsible for childcare. So you really want to think about that. Even if it's online and you're conducting the focus group online, mothers and other parents too, but particularly mothers are responsible for childcare. So maybe trying to organize a focus group at a time that's convenient for them. So moving on to say a bit more about participation. We understand that often there's hesitancy among certain cultural groups to participate in focus group research. And this is for a number of reasons that I talked about before, how they have been mistreated, and then also just didn't get the benefits from working with the researchers actually. Or it could be that they didn't want to discuss sensitive topics. So we really need to think better about how do we want to engage folks in responsive ways. The first thing we really want to think about is, okay, what are the goals of the research? If we're calling it social justice, fine, empowerment, or in the case of some indigenous communities, self-determination, that's really something to consider, as well as participants' abilities, their communication styles, what are their interests and concerns. And in the book, I go in depth with this, and I talk about different ways that we can work with different groups. One way is called sister circles, and you see here in the picture is a group of Black women. So researchers Brown and Johnson, they say a sister circle is a feminist-oriented focus group that acknowledges the culture of Black women, how they communicate, relate to each other, and make meaning. And these groups are not entirely new. They're anchored in a tradition of how Black women have formed community for a very long time, but they can be really useful to advance the empowerment of Black women. It can be really a great way to enhance participation using this format. And I have resources about that if you're interested. You can follow up on that. Another feminist-oriented focus group type would be Mandra's office offers what's called a collective testimony format for Latinas, and she provides a definition of that. And it's a tool to recover the knowledge acquired that women have about their experiences of everyday lives. And they really do provide a way to break the wall of silence that has suppressed so many women and their ideas and emotions for so long. And again, I have resources about that. There's other ways to think about enhancing participation. I just want to say that, again, I go over these in great detail in the book, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. Bloor and colleagues talk about this notion of focusing activities, such as like a rating that you can have participants do, rate something on a scale of 1 to 5. But the caution here is you don't want to focus on the number. If they say, oh, I think that's a 5 or a 1, it's the discussion generated from the rating that you want to pay attention to. I really like to use vignettes. I think those are really great to use. A short story is really good with cultural groups when there's a sensitive topic. This way, it takes the pressure off of them to divulge sensitive information about their health issue, for example, and they can really focus on what the person in the vignette is going through and talk about the health issue through the vignette, for example. So that could be a really good technique to enhance participation. As you can see in the picture, there's lots of art-based approaches. One is photo voice. I've worked with people who use photo voice in a focus group. It's a really great way to enhance participation. Basically what happens is that the participants go off and take pictures based on the topic, and they bring them back to the group and discuss their pictures, why they're important. The researcher can ask them to share narratives in writing or just through the discussion. You could also exhibit them in the community if it makes sense, and you could use them to advocate for things. So it just depends on the project. And the other thing to enhance participation is the use of interpreters, right? So if a person understands like, hey, interpreters are being offered so that I can feel comfortable expressing my ideas in Spanish, for example, that's a great way to enhance participation. You'll have to really think through how you'll use the interpreter if you're going to have them run the entire focus group or translate along the way. And there's pros and cons to that. But I go in that a little bit in the book, but I want to pull back a little bit and say, before all these things happen, a fundamental thing to enhance participation would be rule setting. So before you even begin a focus group, you really want to indicate the rules, right? And this could be anything from reminding people to mute their cell phones to speaking one at a time. And this really does enhance participation if people understand the rules ahead of time. And lastly, I'll just say that, well, two last things I'll say about participation. One is, if you need to allow time for prayer or another cultural practice, then you want to do that. And then you might decide to have a break. So it would be responsive, for example, if you have young kids in a focus group, you may need to allow time for break, or elderly folks who may need to take a break, or if you're online for too long, you may need to take a break. Some of you may need to take a break now, for example. A common question that comes up a lot when I teach on these kinds of topics, especially focus groups, is, okay, what is the ideal size for a focus group? Well, I have some good news and some bad news. So the bad news first is there's no consensus in the qualitative literature that I reviewed that gives an ideal size. However, the good news is they usually range from 4 to 9 participants. Why is that the case? Well, it's because it depends on the purpose of the focus group. So you really want to think about that. So for example, if I'm running focus groups with children, they tend to be smaller in size. The other thing I would recommend is homogeneous grouping and really organizing groups by like characteristics. I really try to steer away from more heterogeneous grouping. That's my personal preference. But again, all of these things are decided by the cultural codes and principles. And I have an example here from Ram. I really like the way that she worked with these folks in Africa for this educational intervention. As you can see, she has very diverse participants. And she had this school governing board, and the people who were on that were in one focus group. She had school management team, and they were in another. Teachers and learners were also in separate groups. So again, we need to think about the status that people have in an organization as well. So I think that's just a great example of thinking through how to organize people, and that reference is in the resources. So this is a huge slide with lots and lots of pictures, but this is to emphasize the point of the importance of the environment. And this is not to be taken lightly. I think thinking about the environment is really critical, especially because it has implications for data collection. Nowadays, the environment, as you can see in the corner here, is online due to COVID, which has been really helpful for cultural responsiveness, because why? It has enabled us to maintain connections with cultural groups, and cultural groups, many of them have become more comfortable with online platforms, and we're able to get to more geographical areas and remote settings. At the same time, though, still some people don't have access to Zoom and other online technologies, and some people are still not as familiar. So you'll want to assess those kinds of things, their access and familiarity with online technology to advance cultural responsiveness. The other thing is the environment also includes informing people that they have options for how they want to show up. And so for youth, for example, when I conducted focus groups online, many of them decided that they did not want to be on the video camera, and they frequently used the chat. And I honestly didn't care for that, but I had to check myself and think, what's the most responsive thing here? Yes, it was okay, because as I thought about it, I said, you know what? The chat feature aligns with their culture of texting. So if you decide to use online strategies like polling or things like this, just make sure that folks know how to use these things. I think the most important thing about the environment, particularly for marginalized groups, is that it be non-threatening and that people are made to feel safe and welcome. And so from a critical theory perspective, I do not think there is a such thing as a neutral space, right? A space is going to always advantage, some people over others. So you just want to think very carefully about that and try to go with spaces that are familiar. A few final points here to say, to be culturally responsive, as you can see in the picture, you want to think about, mobility kinds of things. Do people have room in the setting to position themselves. You want to think about the furniture. These days, as we come out of COVID, you know, how to situate things for social distancing. And then also lighting and even room temperature are important things to consider in the environment. Those are not trivial things because, again, they all impact data quality. If people are cold, uncomfortable, they can't see something, it is going to impact your data quality. So speaking of data quality, I also want to talk about some ways to think about establishing quality. The students I work with, they are very much concerned about this topic. Are we doing it right? Is this the way to implement a focus group? And so I have some criteria for thinking about quality, how to establish rigorous focus groups. So before I go into these criteria, I just want to say something that I didn't mention earlier, which is about the use of a note taker. I talked about the moderator skills, but as a moderator, you definitely want to have a note taker in the focus group, whether it's online or in person. Why is that important? Because as can be seen in today's presentation, sometimes technology can fail. And so you want to have a backup person that's able to collect the data in case that happens or continue on with the focus group. Whether online or in person, you also want to have a person capture the dynamics of the group, the nonverbal interactions that happen. That is hugely important as well. So having a note taker there also can keep you in line if you're missing something or you didn't see anything there right there to help and assist. So having a note taker is very, very helpful to enhance cultural responsiveness. So going back to establishing quality very quickly, one of the things to keep in mind are these three criteria. The first is reflexivity, and Hazel Simonet talks a lot about this notion of reflexivity. And for each criteria, I have some questions that you can ask regarding that. So for reflexivity, you want to ask questions like, how and to what extent did my communications and evaluation, research process, practice, and product enhance versus erode trust? Because trust is central to quality, right? If the participants do not trust you, it will impact your data quality. The next criteria is methodological validity. This comes from Karen Kirkhart's work, and she has an entire framework. I'm only using two from her framework. Methodological validity is the first of the two. And again, probably you can tell this has to do with how the focus groups themselves are implemented. Was the focus group protocol piloted is a question. Do not underestimate piloting the focus group protocol. It really helps you to clarify how your questions are functioning and what kind of data you can expect to get. So the other thing is, did you engage participants' culture from a strength-based perspective throughout the conduct of the focus group? All of these things enhance methodological rigor. The last one, and maybe in some ways, I wouldn't say the most important, but clearly of great importance, is the consequential validity. And this is why many people don't trust us, again, when we come in and conduct research and conduct evaluations, because they don't see the end result of it. So the question is then, how will the findings from the focus group be used, particularly from a critical standpoint, to advance social justice in that particular context? And you really want to think through, does conducting this focus group present any consequences for people in the group? Does it put them in jeopardy of anything if you ask a particular question or if you share these findings with particular stakeholders? So you want to be very clear about that. Another way of thinking about quality, which I think is very important to enhance rigor of our focus groups, culturally responsive focus groups, is to think about coherence, right? And so if you remember earlier in the framework, we want to think about this question, which is central. How well do the interpretations reflect the cultural context and content relevant to the cultural theories? So if you're using Black feminist thought, how does that show up, right? How do your interpretations reflect what people actually told you? The other thing is correspondence, which the question related to that is, how well is contextual diversity and variations of perspective represented and accounted for? The point of this is that there is diversity within diversity. Groups are not monolithic. All Black women are not the same. There's diversity within that cultural group. And so your focus groups, your findings should reflect that. Lastly, I'll end with fruitfulness. This may be one of the less well-known criteria for thinking about quality, but nonetheless, I think it's hugely important. In what ways does the inquiry open up new understandings and perspective on the unique cultural context? And so again, disrupting a lot of the meta-narrative around these groups is hugely important, and focus groups can be really influential in doing that and bring a unique perspective that has not been unearthed before. So at this point, I just want to briefly bring more of what I said to life. I'm not sure anymore where I am on time. I hope I am doing well in terms of time given the interruptions. But essentially, this is a example from the field from a PDS evaluation that was conducted. And I just want to go over first, well, what is a PDS, right? And this evaluation was conducted for a professional development school. That's what PDS stands for. And for those of you unfamiliar with a PDS, it's a teacher preparation and development. That is the focus. And it's also focused on preparing new teachers, providing them with professional development for the faculty, which is the school is usually in partnership with the university. So it's a partnership that a school has with a university, for example, that engages in inquiry meant to improve student achievement. So it is a partnership that schools are engaged in. And Synergy is the school that we evaluated that is part of this PDS. And so here's a representation of the cultural contexts that were involved in this particular evaluation. And this graphic is intended to spell out to you some of the context that was involved there. So basically we see here we have Synergy, we have the PDS model itself, there's a way to implement it, we have the community context, we also have district level policies, and then we also have state and national policies. So basically, Synergy is a school, it's still there, and it serves over 500 students from pre-kindergarten to 5th grade. It's a Title I school, which means that it has a large majority of students who receive financial assistance. And so basically, it has a large Latino demographic, but the faculty and instructional staff are largely white and female. So it's a quite interesting school dynamic there. So we took all this in mind, the context in mind, and we decided that we wanted to do a formative evaluation. And basically, the formative evaluation was meant to tell the extent to which the school was developing as a PDF because it was a new school. And so we wanted to understand how was it as a new school developing as a PDS. And so we did a lot of qualitative work, observations, individual interviews, document reviews, and we did focus groups with parents and students, which is what I really want to focus on. So to kind of bring this home, I really do want to focus on how does what I did in that evaluation relate to the framework that I brought up earlier. So in this particular context, we really aim to advance social justice by addressing or conducting, focus groups with the most vulnerable people or stakeholders who are often marginalized or overlooked. In this case, parents and students. Then we also thought of being a lifelong learner and valuing participants' culture. And in this context, it meant being attentive to what we thought we knew about the school district, given our prior experience with the school district and things we learned elsewhere. So we had to be sure to carefully listen and learn about the experiences that the parents and students told us without coloring their perceptions with our assumptions or biases. In terms of reflexivity, we considered ourselves as instruments, as culturally responsive evaluators. We embraced the questions posed by Hazel Simonet that I talked about earlier. We did feel that we established trust with the participants because they did share their concerns. We reflected on our use of the focus groups, and we thought about the weakness of the focus groups, which was the fact that ultimately it does rely on our own interpretations. But the strength of using focus groups in this case, as we reflected, was that we really had a nice triangulation given our research team. So each of us had access to the focus group data, and we each reviewed transcripts from the focus group data, and we were able to really enhance the validity of our findings that way and make use of that researcher triangulation along the way. Also, in terms of being interconnected with others and committed to respectful care for participants, we took on what's called an educative stance. We really positioned ourselves as learners again, thinking about the implications of our practice in the focus groups. And so we really tried to make sure that we contributed to a productive dialogue and we centered their needs. And through that process, we learned about them and ourselves as researchers, which was hugely important. And we built on the ways that we paid attention to the intersections of their identities with the school, which was hugely important. We had many different identities, parents, teachers, students, but we had to think through those identities relative to the school. We took on a strength-based approach in this context because in the case of students, for example, I just want to highlight them. In their focus groups, we really, because they're so vulnerable, what often happens in research with children is that we tend to conduct research on children instead of with them. So we really want to take a stance that minors were complete people with values and viewpoints and agency. They weren't half people or people without agency. And so this was the strength-based perspective that we had when we talked to children. We really believe that the children we talked to in the focus groups were experts of their own experience. And we viewed them as persons with abilities to describe their experiences at Synergy, the PDS. So that's a strength-based approach that we took with the children in particular. Then also, as a change agent, we attended to this part of the framework in at least two ways. One way is that we were mindful that we did have university status because we worked at a university and we're also evaluators. So we had to address those power dynamics in the relationship that we had. And so we were very attentive to how we responded to parents in our discussions with them. And we always emphasized making it comfortable and enjoyable. And then we told the parents that up front, when you participate in the focus group, you can expect that we will forward this information to the larger PDS group. And so we wanted to influence change through our evaluation report in this case. And then also, we allowed teachers and students to describe who they are in many different ways. We consulted with other people in the PDS context. There was this person called the family engagement specialist, and we consulted with her. We found a convenient location to conduct the focus groups in the neighborhood library. This was pre-COVID. We included food and childcare, all of these different things. So that was very important to us, and we wanted to make sure that we understood the dominant issues. So all of that contributed to that. Then as co-constructors of knowledge, we wanted to provide space for the children in particular to share their experiences, believing that they're whole people. So we were accommodating to their different learning styles, and we provided space for them to write, draw, and I'll never forget this one young lady decided to sing and dance during the focus group, and we loved it. It was awesome. And so it was very impactful time to co-construct with the children and the parents as well, but I just wanted to emphasize the kids because they were awesome. In terms of awareness of their dynamic character, culture, of course, everybody has multiple identities. So we had parents who were African American, Latinx, and white. We also had students who were of different grade levels, and we wanted to understand how all these different identities interacted with Synergy partnership with the university. So our focus group questions, the protocol itself, really tried to attend to that by recognizing that within that protocol. And then lastly, I'll emphasize, it wasn't so much the theory. I mean, the whole approach really was culturally responsive, but I want to talk more about the methodological techniques. And so we really addressed cultural responsiveness there by conducting two of the three, in Spanish. We provided food again. Childcare was also provided. We took the focus group to the neighborhood which was convenient for parents to get to after work, and they were semi-structured to allow for parents to share their stories. In terms of the kids, again, we wanted to maximize their comfort level, and we did focus groups with them during their lunchtime. They were able to eat first and then join our focus group. We had lots of markers and different paper and things that they could write on, and we talked to them twice. So we talked to the same group of students, the third graders and the fifth graders, twice during their lunchtime, and we just made it fun and engaging for them. And they shared a lot of information with us, things they were concerned with, things that they liked about the school and how the PDS was going. So again, all of these things we thought were different ways that we worked through enhancing cultural responsiveness in this particular evaluation. And so that just is a very broad overview, but I hope that some of the things I talked about, again, might be helpful for you to think about how to engage more responsibly with the groups. I will say, lastly, that as part of the evaluation, we did think well about the translation of the culturally responsive focus groups we did with the Spanish-speaking parents and really work through that as well, making sure we had strong interpretations. And so we had, again, a person who spoke Spanish on the research team who was also reflective of the community identity. So we had, for example, African-American researcher, myself, or evaluator. We had a Latina evaluator, and we had 3 white evaluators on the team who had identified with the school as well. And not only just racially, but also in terms of expertise. So we had people who were experts in engaging in art-based kinds of activities, and then in culturally responsive work, and as well as the curriculum that the school implemented. So when we think about cultural responsiveness, it's just not race. Race is very important, but it's that and beyond. So to wrap up, these are all the references. You can feel free to look at these and follow up on things that I touched on today. They're all here. You can take a closer look at that. And these are the ways that you can feel free to contact me. And I'm open to questions.
Great. Thank you, Jory. That was really good. And even with all the technical issues, I think you got through it very well. So thank you. And I'm just going to make myself presenter. And I just want to point out a few things before oops, I made a mistake. I just want to point out we're having the virtual conference again this year, and the abstracts are open. So please submit an abstract if you're interested by June 30th. And Allie has some questions from people that she'll ask you.
Yes.
Okay.
So Jory, lots of great questions coming in, and we'll make sure to get them to you so that you can kind of answer and think about all of them. But just to pick 2 before we sign off, one from Jillian is, how do you see the role of the insider-outsider researcher play in culturally responsive focus groups?
Oh, this is a very good question. So from a critical perspective, it is my thinking that we are always both and. We're always both insiders and outsiders. It's just a matter of the extent to which. I do not assume that because, for example, I am speaking to Black women, that I am totally an insider, because there are other identities that I have to consider. So, you know, in some ways, the insider-outsider, now that I think about it, can be limiting as a dichotomy, right? One or the other. It can push people to think that way, either on one or the other. But I think it's more messy than that and more complex than that. And if we're really thinking about being culturally responsive, I guess I would just emphasize that we think about the extent to which, you know, we're both, and how it is that part. I think Hazel Simonette's advice is regarding that. How do the participants view us? And really thinking through not just how you think, you know, how you think you're coming across, but really, you know, how it is that they view you, really getting some more insight about that. So those are my thoughts about insider outsider. I hope that was helpful.
Great, thank you. And one more that we have time for, from Ana Lucia. Do you have any tips while conducting an asynchronous focus group online?
I think there's lots of benefits to that. I would think about giving the questions in advance that you want to ask. The beauty of asynchronous is that it allots more time for people to respond. And I think you could build on that by giving them a chance to think about their responses in time. I think you have to be cautious because asynchronous formats a lot of time rely on text-based discussions, and it just depends on your group and how well they're able to type and communicate well in those kinds of formats. So for example, you may want to encourage people, if they don't want to write it out, to encourage drawing or memes or emoticons or different ways to communicate asynchronously as well. I hope that was helpful.
Yes,
Yeah, no,
thank you very much, Jory. And Stacy, I think over to you to wrap up.
Yep. So thanks, everyone. It was a great presentation, great questions, and just want to thank Jory for her time putting this together, and also for Ali being my co-presenter.
And thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Jory, and thank you everyone who joined. And the recording will be available soon. And just thanks again for spending your afternoon with us.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.